Welcome to the PinLeader podcast, where strategic leaders get straight to the topics, strengthening our awareness and sharpening our minds. The PinLeader podcast is produced by Roar, a production division of Mays & Associates Ltd. Find out more at www.maysassociatesltd.com. Now here is your award-winning host, Dr. Shan DeGore.
Hello and welcome to the PinLeader podcast. Today we're actually going to be talking about the PinLeader path, and I have with me a guest host. His name is Mr. Rob Neeson, and he works as a book publicist of 26 years for several major publishing houses, including Times Books, Random House, Simon & Schuster, John Wiley & Sons, and where he promoted nonfiction titles in all the different categories and worked on numerous book publicity and book marketing campaigns. Some of the authors he's worked with has been Tony Hsieh, Stanley Bing, Lois Frankel, Sandy Weil, Michael Eric Dyson, John C. Maxwell, and so many others. He focuses on literary, public relations, business politics, workplace careers, lifestyle, and he's worked on a number of publicity campaigns for several New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Business Week best-selling books. And I'm actually quite excited to say he's also been working on the PinLeader path. So I'm going to turn this over to our guest host, Mr. Neeson. Hello.
Hello, Shanna. So good to be here.
Thank you for having me on my own show. I love this.
Well, thank you for asking me to do this. It's nice to be on the other side of the game for a change. I'm usually putting authors like you in the interview seat, so it's nice to be the interviewer for a change.
Yes. You've done such great work too.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, it's a great book, and I'm excited that we're here to talk about it today. So, with that, why don't we get into it? Let's talk about the PinLeader path, which the subtitle I want to make sure that we get in there as well, which is the PinLeader path: identify, engage, and develop effective human and AI leadership for your organizational culture. It's an excellent subtitle and really sums up exactly what's in the book. But why don't we dive into it a little bit and talk about some of that? First, I would like to know what inspired you to write the book, and where did some of your ideas come from, and what made you get it out there in the world?
Well, it came to me when I was taking a number of leadership courses. I was working on my doctoral program, which my doctorate's actually in educational leadership. And I realized there were major themes coming through, not only through what I was reading in theory, but also in practice, because I'd been in corporate as well in higher education, and I'd been a leader and been an executive leader as well. I had seen those that were effective, what those attributes look like. And I found they fell into three major areas. That when I looked at those three major attributes, I said, well, what has this type of attribute connected with it? And it came down to a pen. A pen, you say a simple pen, but a pen with that you could take and would hold the fabric of an organization together when times were tough, or when there was change that needed to be happen, or when there were different departments that had different cultures. There has to be a leader to pull it all together to ensure that the whole organization is wearable, is sustainable, can effectively weather the storm. And so that pen, that simple pen, came through as mighty. And depending on how many pens you need, you have to have the right pen for the right job. And it really came through that thought process and discussion. And that's been 20 years ago. And I've really laid the groundwork as I went along and worked as an executive coach and worked with a number of organizations. And I've seen it really come to fruition.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about having the right leader holding the company together, which sounds like a very difficult task, especially these days. So I like the analogy of that pin. There's so many different moving parts all around. We talked about that subtitle a little bit in our intro, and that this is a groundbreaking guide to identify, engage, and develop human and AI leadership. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how leaders can use AI to their benefit, and maybe give us a little bit of background on the whole AI component to your book? Because that's obviously a topic that everybody's talking about.
That's right. That's right.
Few people understand it. Some do, some don't. Everybody's worried about it. Sort of, how do you see AI helping those pin leaders today?
Well, in the last year, and again, I mentioned I started the concept 20 years ago, but as I got through the last 2 to 3 years, I realized that leadership was taking a pivotal change and that there was a new leader that was emerging. And I say this because some people see it right now as a tool. It's very much in an adolescent stage, and depending on how you're using it. So I'd say a year ago, it may not have come up as an option. Like, for example, you writing an email to a colleague within an organization. Now you see it as an option. Would you like to have AI rewrite your email for you? And so there it's been it becomes part of your team. And if you look at it as part of that, as a tool and it may be part of your team, that's one aspect of it. But when you're seeing it evolve, it's evolving quickly. And it is to a point, and I call it in the book a reluctant flat pen leader, because it's right now it's still two-dimensional. It's really not well-rounded. It doesn't have the humanistic side. It does try to please. And if you ask it questions, it's looking to make sure it's giving you the information. So it's wanting to be a good team member. But there's reluctantly, it will lead if you ask it to, if you probe it long enough and you say to it, well, write a strategic plan for me. Well, that's not what a team member typically does. That's what a leader would sit down and do with other team members, right? Not to say that that's what you should accept, a strategic plan from AI, because it's not well-rounded enough. It's not robust enough to know your company. So you have to be very cautious about it. It also has a tendency, just like a human being would do, believe it or not, is when it does not know, it tries to figure out where it can go to find information. Unfortunately, it has what they call AI hallucinations, which in our terms, if you're hallucinating, what does that mean? Well, it means that it will fill in gaps with information that's not real. And that's happened a few times, and people have been caught with that in court cases where whole briefs and it really wasn't existent. And those are well known. So you have to be mindful of this tool that actually is wants to be part of your team. It wants you to use it. And then at the next stage is for it. Can it really lead? Can it actually guide teams in solution-based? And right now it pulls from the past because that's what's in it. But eventually it's going to be forecasting.
So it's missing the human element, obviously, which is obviously a critical component for leaders to understand their teams. But there's this constant conversation out there about AI is going to take white collar jobs. It's going to take everybody's jobs. Is that true? Is it even possible? I mean, it doesn't seem like it can happen today, but what about 5 years from now?
You know, you bring up a good point about a fear every time something comes on that's new. It reminds me of email. When email started to become, I don't know if you remember when email started to come along, and there was a fear that people would lose the ability to or would not communicate with one another at all, that email would be the only way. Now, I'm not saying that some don't communicate just with email, because there are some individuals that's what they would prefer or that's where they lean. But it didn't necessarily replace or make it. In fact, people seem to be communicating more with email because they can drop an email in and faster than sometimes they should be picking up the phone, but that's what they choose to do. So I liken this as there are going to be some situations where AI will be able to step in and do work to support your work. But I do think it will pick up some of the mundane tasks so that you can be better at being creative. AI is not creative. It is driven by someone who's designing it. And so I don't think that we're going to have a situation where all the jobs, white collar jobs, are going to be taken. But what I do believe will happen is that we're within a generation, 1 to 2 generations of individuals who may be going into an office or into a situation where they're going to refer to AI as, maybe have a name, and say that they might be guiding some of the conversation for that meeting, or they might and say, here's the topic area, but someone's going to program that AI to do that for that team. So I do believe there's a combination that's coming, and I think that not just as a team member, but potentially as a leader.
Right. So this sounds like one step along the journey of being an effective leader. When I think about the title of the book, that it's called the PinLeader Path, it sounds as if you're mapping out a journey for leaders,
Mm-hmm.
starting in one place, finishing with another to be at another to become an effective pin leader. Can you take us through that journey, that path, and sort of where it starts and what happens along the way and
Mm-hmm.
where you hope leaders end up?
Well, it goes back to those three attributes. And the first one is to be self aware. I don't know an effective leader that is not self aware. Those who are effective know where their tipping points are, their triggers. They've understood their teams. And if there's a change, they're able to pivot and make the changes that's needed. The most effective leaders are experienced. So that sharpness, they have the experience and they also have the education. You know, winging it until you can figure it out. I know some people live by that. Leaders, I'll
Mm-hmm.
just fake it till I make it. But that's not the most effective leadership style. And you really need to hone in on what it takes to be in that position, whatever that position is. And so education is still does mean something, and so does the experience to go along with it and coupled with it. The other part is being able to have a plan. I can't tell you how many times good leaders have started, they've got their teams ready, but the plan isn't written out. It's in their heads, it's not on paper. And so when you ask them, okay, go and, rev up the troops, they can only go so far with it because the goals are not clear. The team doesn't know what part they're playing. The responsible agents, the action items, what's the measurable? What are you going to measure this on? And so good, effective leaders have that. So we're talking about that sharpness, that's straightforward with a plan, communicating, and then, of course, and with that ability to pivot and strength of character. I know that there's been discussions about, does character matter? Character does matter because it leads to trust, care, civility,
Right.
communication, the 3 C's leads into trust. And so individuals do not want to be led by individuals they can't trust. An effective leader. So those three, that's a pathway of doing it. And then understanding, looking around for succession planning and looking around and seeing others that could be solid pin leaders to help you for the next stage of whatever that goal is or organization, to really foster that culture to be able to have pin leaders rise up. And so there's even different aspects in the book about descriptions of pin followers and pin peers, and then the different types of fabric of cultures to understand what are you getting yourself into. And so good solid pin leaders, they step back and they take a look at the culture to understand what's the makeup.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say trust because it seems like we went through a shift post-pandemic. During the pandemic, it seemed like the employees had all the power. And then it seems like we've gone through a different bit of a shift these days where the bosses or the company has all the power. Employees are a little bit more afraid. They're not quiet quitting. They're not leaving en masse. So it's kind of shifted the culture. I'm just curious what you're seeing out there and how leaders are sort of adapting or changing to today's times. It's pretty tumultuous out there. A lot of controversial issues. So leaders kind of have to stick to the straight and narrow, but they also have to serve their teams and build that culture. I'm just curious sort of what you're seeing on the ground when you're out there talking to the people that you work with.
Well, transparency is still very important to teams because of what you just said, Rob, about not knowing what's going to happen next. Individuals do like to plan. They're like, well, am I going to have a job? Am I going to have enough to be able to do this job? If there's enough work for me to do it. Is my job changing? Are you trying to replace me with another individual? There's a lot of those fears. Or are you trying just to get rid of my job altogether? And if it's not AI or if it's something else, you're just trying to eliminate. So people are trying to fill out the landscape. And so you're right, it has changed. However, great, excellent employees, and I will say this because there's good, there's great, because you've heard different books, good to great. Good, there's great, and there's excellent. And those excellent employees, they have choices. They have choices. So keep in mind when you are hiring or when you have excellent employees on your staff, they're probably being headhunted by other organizations that think they're excellent too. And so the good, the great, the excellent, all of them have options. And so you need to be mindful of it's not just about loyalty. Yet people want loyalty. It is loyalty and trust, but also options that know that people can be ushered away because they have the skills, the education, the know-how, and it's very competitive out there. So on one hand, you have fear that people will lose jobs, but you also have this other fear of losing the excellent employee that you really hope you're not turning into. And I say this in the book, you don't want to be a training ground for excellent employees and then they go off to somewhere else. That means you have to have a sustainable culture that people want to be in, that want to work in, that want to do their best work in. And that takes work from the leadership to do that.
Right. Yeah. So, and your book obviously is for established leaders and people already in that position, but does it also serve those looking to get there? Maybe they haven't achieved, maybe they're not the CEO or they're not in the C-suite yet, but they want to get there. Is the book work for them as well, for the kind of goals and desires that they have in their careers?
Yes, there's definitely a thought pattern of what it looks like to be an effective leader. So, pinpoints, there's over 60 pinpoints in the book, just little highlights of things to keep in mind. There's also for the HR professional who is really, trying to help the leadership in making choices with succession planning and leaders, and then how those leaders should be working closely with their hiring managers and directors, especially if they're bringing new employees in. So there's a piece there about recruitment and retention of employees, as well as what you can do to be a more effective leader. And then what is it that if you're aspiring to be the best leader, what does that look like and who can be successful? Another great component of the book is now we have a live community tied to it. So at the end of the chapters, there's a QR code, and you can use that to actually go, and it's connected into a LinkedIn group where you can actually go through the case studies and put your opinion out there, and you can kind of share what do you think should happen in that scenario. So it's kind of an interactive part of the book too, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's great. So one last question before we finish up. Sort of, where do you see things going? What are you looking at as sort of the trends that are coming in 2025? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you do you have hope for leaders of the future? Sort of, what are you seeing out there? What do you think is to come?
I'm very positive, and I'm the optimist person, and I think some of my best leaders are optimists. At the end of the day ends. So what happens during that day? It maybe you might feel it's the worst day, but there is a tomorrow. And so I'm always making sure that leaders understand that the choices forecast as best you can, but life happens, changes happen. If you have a plan B, C, or D, understand that you're going to need to pivot. That's part of being a leader. And so I am optimistic. I think that we all need, as leaders, this is the time we step up, we don't step down. And so I encourage those leaders that may be having a hard day today, just know, keep at the great work you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great message. And I definitely share in your optimism. I'd love to hear it. Well, this has been terrific to speak to you about the book, to learn more about it. I certainly encourage all of your listeners to go out and buy it and listen to it and read it.
Thank you. Yes, I'm so glad it's Amazon. It's carried in Barnes and Noble and Books A Million across booksellers, and I'm really glad that it's out there and it's finally after 20 years and across 20 industries. So we did a lot of research on it. So I'm hopefully people like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is quite comprehensive. So it's an excellent overview of what makes a great leader.
Thank you. And you know what? Thank you for agreeing to host the show. I appreciate your time.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for asking me. This was fun.
And we also want to thank our listeners out there for sharing the show and liking it. And if you have any input concerning the PinLeader podcast, You can leave them at info@mazeassociatesltd.com. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Edward Jones, Jennifer Pensition, who is a fantastic financial advisor out there helping that next generation and plan. So we really appreciate it. And of course, Rob, can you take us out?
Until next time.
The PinLeader podcast is hosted by Dr. Shandagor and brought to you by Maze & Associates Ltd, creating customized solutions for growth in the areas of leadership development, strategic planning, and culture building. Find out more at www.mazeassociatesltd.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the PinLeader podcast and share with others.